Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has pleaded not guilty to all charges in the U.S. federal court in New York, marking his first public appearance since being seized by U.S. forces over the weekend. At the same time, just miles away, the UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting where dozens of countries condemned the U.S. military action against Venezuela as a violation of international law and a crime of aggression. So what is behind the forcible seizure of a sitting head of state? What does this episode tell us about the direction of U.S. power and influence in the Western Hemisphere as we head into 2026? And what impact could it have on the global order and the international community at large? Join us for the discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, joining me today are Mark Seddon, Director of the Center for UN Studies at the University of Buckingham and also former speechwriter for UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at American University. Yin Zhiguang, Professor of International Politics at Fudan University in Shanghai. And Renan Holanda Montenegro, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Federal University of Pernambuco. Welcome to the program. Renan, I will start with you. So share with us your observation of the sentiment from the public, either in where you are in Brazil and also people in the region. What's their response to what happened to Venezuela and its leader, Maduro?
Well, I think that first of all, what happened in Venezuela at the eyes of the Latin American people is that it's nothing new. The United States supported intervention and regime change under different presidents in different times and finally in different circumstances, like the episode of Bush Sr. in Panama, like the Monroe Doctrine at the 19th century. And more recently, during the Cold War, the U.S. also supported military dictatorship across South America. Even the rhetorical use of drug trafficking is not new, since the same narrative device was used to justify Noriega's deposition in Panama. The novelty today is, I guess, direct military intervention by air, sea, and land. And we should pay close attention during this year of 2026 because we have relevant presidential elections here in South America specifically. In May, it's going to be the presidential election in Colombia, and October here in Brazil. And if I may, it's interesting to note that Brazil's position has been carefully ambiguous, I must say. Brazil did not recognize Maduro's election, but it now recognizes Delcy Rodriguez as the new president. And official statements do not name the United States, do not name Maduro, and do not use the word kidnapping. Mm-hmm. But the silence is political. The community of Latin American and Caribbean countries failed to produce a joint statement due to internal divisions. But Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and Spain, they signed a joint note. And also, it's interesting to note, just to finalize this first answer, that at the UN Security Council meeting, Brazil made a statement in Spanish, which is a symbolic signal of regional positioning.
Yeah, very nuanced response from different parties regionally, locally. But Anton, if you look at the case, the trial of Mr. Maduro inside the U.S., I mean, how should this case be assessed legally and politically? And what is Washington really trying to achieve by putting a sitting president on trial inside the U.S.?
Sue, the legal aspect of this story is the cover for the geopolitical intervention that we just saw, because the Trump administration understands that this is problematic from the point of view of international law. Not that that's ever stopped the United States or most other great powers from intervening in other powers' affairs. This is the history of humanity. But the Trump administration understands that it needs a legal cover, hence the whole narco-terrorist issue. Now, Maduro was arraigned yesterday. He pleaded not guilty. His next appearance in court will be in the middle of March. And his legal team, which I imagine is still in the process of being put together, has not asked for a speedy trial. They are willing to go to full court. So this is going to drag out for months. Whether the United States government will be able to prove its case is an open question. I have seen no publicly presented evidence that Maduro was actually heading a drug cartel, sort of Scarface style. But I don't think that's really an important component here, because the importance was to remove him from power. And I can guarantee you that the American public and most of the other Western state publics will forget about Maduro after a while, because the point of this was to get him out of Venezuela and to send a very powerful signal to the other Latin American states about who is in charge in the Western Hemisphere. And this, in a sense, is very consistent with the national security policy that the Trump administration just issued, a month ago, just before the Christmas holidays started, maybe a month and a half ago, in which it very publicly and clearly, black on white, stated that the Western Hemisphere is the reserve, the area of vital national security interests for the United States, which means that the U.S. can do anything it wants to anyone it chooses to do this to. And the remarkable thing is how successfully the military operational part of this coup went off, because within about 3.5 hours, Maduro's presidency was over. And it is absolutely clear to me, given the very weak military response in Venezuela itself, that the United States, the CIA most importantly, but there were probably multiple other agencies involved, that they bought off all the people that needed to be bought off in order to find Maduro, seize Maduro, and to do this with a minimum of losses on the American side, which is not the case, by the way, on the Venezuelan or the Cuban side. And we'll be hearing about the body count and the civilians for days and weeks ahead. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the rules-based international order. And I think that the most important thing that I can say about this is that the BRICS Plus countries could not wish for a better endorsement for what the global South is doing, which is regionalizing its affairs and trying to work with itself around the Western countries, which, by the way, are conspicuously silent about this affair, especially in Europe.
Yes. Well, at the same time, when the trial went on, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting. Mark, the UN Secretary General, said the U.S. raid violated the UN Charter, and many member states, including Colombia, Cuba, Brazil, condemned it as a grave violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. Russia, China, and others also demanded the immediate release of Mr. Maduro and the end of further U.S. military action. But at the same time, we do notice the silence, as Anton mentioned, in mostly like European countries. What do you make of the different response here?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's very interesting to see the response, which does vary, because Spain, of course, has been very critical. A number of countries across Europe have, of course, cited international law and the UN Charter. There's a lot of pressure, for instance, on the British government and the German government to say the same. Frankly, the governments have been caught in the headlights, rather frightened of Trump, having invested a lot of time trying to get on side with him. They don't want to risk all of this. But, when I worked for the UN, one of the first things the President of the General Assembly did when I was there was actually to send the UN Charter, to every member state. Every member state knows what the UN Charter says. It's quite clear that the United States is in breach of it. The best defense it may mount is that it was involved in self-defense, a very difficult case, frankly, to prove when Venezuela was not attacking the United States. So the what is loosely termed the international rules-based order, which, of course, many countries in the global south have often said, well, it's tended to be a kind of Western-influenced international rules-based order, but nonetheless put in place at the end of the Second World War, essentially built around the UN Charter to prevent another war taking place again. Many countries are now very, very nervous. And that's why I do slightly disagree, because while there isn't much sympathy anywhere for President Maduro as such, it's clear from the language that President Trump is using, it's very different from what has traditionally been the case when Grenada was, for instance, the government was toppled in Grenada. The head of state, by the way, was the Queen, the British Queen. She wasn't even informed when that happened, when Ronald Reagan sent the Marines up the beach. But, you know, back then, the United States talked about democracy. Now it talks about oil. And beyond that, I think that the reason why what has happened in Venezuela does have a major and will have a continuing effect is that the threats that are being made to Greenland and Denmark are very clear. And certainly some of the Western leaders have been speaking out against that. The threats that have been made against Canada, another NATO member, have been very clear. And of course, in recent days, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, the list goes on. So, you know, if you're going to have a kind of a new world disorder built around declared areas of self-interest or national interest, the United States is claiming the Western Hemisphere. Presumably, this is why Trump is relaxed about Russia claiming parts of Ukraine and all the rest of it. You know, this is no international order at all. This is anarchy. And I think people can see that. And this is what people are very worried about. This is the big difference, I think. It's quite naked aggression now. We've seen it in Ukraine. We've seen it now in Venezuela and other places. And a lot of countries around the world are feeling very, very nervous.
Yes, a lot of countries are feeling nervous. Zhiguang, if you look at what happened, the U.S. talked about, narcotics, as a part of the accusation against Maduro and the leadership. And then they talked about oil, and then they talked about the sphere of influence. This is our hemisphere, and simply somehow no influence of our adversary or enemy should be existed in this region. What is really the U.S. going after, and what's the impact globally in terms of international relations, in terms of global order?
Oh, well, I mean, I completely agree with the previous speaker's point of view, so I don't want to repeat all those comments. What I want to bring in further is the implication to Americans' domestic politics. I mean, this is not the first time that the Americans have done intervention. This is nor the first time the Americans have used secret operation to top a foreign leader. But this is the first time they've done it, with two exceptions. One, this is very open. This is publicly declaration. It's all a show. Trump really wants everybody to see it. And secondly, Trump did it without seeking for congressional approval. Now, the implication for that, beyond international order, I think it is more severe. The implication is to American domestic politics, because we could see it as if this is a Donald Trump's loyalty test. He, through the kidnapping of Maduro, he managed to make sure to test. There are generals and peoples who are behind him who are willing to act legal action without seeking congressional approval. And so based on that, he's basically gotten up a group of sort of close associate that are willing to do everything that he demands. And this has further implication to the United States domestic politics. Let's think about the upcoming midterm. If Trump again claims that his position of presidentialship was unlawfully deprived by some opponent, will he mobilize the same type of gang of people and do the same thing within America? I think this reminds us of a potential of true anarchy.
Well, this is a very important question, I would say. And, for now, we can leave it for the Americans to sort out, I guess. Yes, we will obviously follow that closely, when the midterm election starts, or begins there. If we stick to this global impact, Anton, I will start with you here. So sphere of influence. Do you think the Trump government is serious, or the Western Hemisphere, somehow belongs to us? And what does that mean to Asia, to Europe? So basically, no rule of law, no international law, whatever to follow. Just we just follow our strength. The might makes right.
Yes, absolutely. And for anyone who is surprised by this grim reality of human affairs, I would recommend reading Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, which is only about 2,500 years old, and runs through the very same arguments that we are talking about now. This has always been the reality of human affairs. One of the novelties that the 20th century introduced to geopolitics is to inject it with ideology and to create a language of international rights and human rights in which geopolitical decisions were regularly clothed. That didn't change the reality of the calculus behind the American intervention in Vietnam, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and I can go on for a very long time giving out examples. This is how realpolitik works. Trump is following on the Monroe Doctrine, which has never actually disappeared in its general conceptual outline. The United States in the 20th century, actually since the 1890s, has had a very long and distinguished history of interventions directly south of its border in Mexico and then all over the Caribbean basin and in Latin America. This is how great powers have behaved always. And so the difference with Trump is that he doesn't clothe this in the language of international rights or even human rights. He clothes this in very honest and grimly realistic language of resource grabs. And that's exactly what's going on here. It's oil. It's about the petrodollar. It is also about keeping Eurasian states, especially the great powers that have acquired some influence in Venezuela under Maduro, namely China and Russia, out of the Western Hemisphere. The problem, of course, is that the global South is looking at this, and intelligent people there are understandably asking the question that if the United States considers the Western Hemisphere its playground and considers anything that happens there as a vital national security concern, then why is it that, for example, as NATO begins to move into Ukraine, are the Russians denied any kind of vital national security interests, and that in a country that actually is right on their border, unlike Venezuela, that is in another hemisphere, that being the southern hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And the same questions can be asked about China and Taiwan and a whole slew of territorial national security issues that all major powers, and minor powers, by the way, have on their borders. So again, as I mentioned before, no greater impetus to forums such as the BRICS Plus and other regional organizations could have been activated than what the U.S. has done in Venezuela. And the interesting thing is that we do have a midterm election ahead. Trump is going to try to rack up foreign policy successes for the Republicans to at least not lose the House and the Senate. And I have a feeling that this is just the beginning and that he may be moving on to other countries. And Greenland, I think, which is not a country but a territory of Denmark, I think Greenland is very seriously in the crosshairs. And I think the next developments will be over there. And we'll see what impact this will have on the NATO alliance.
Right. Before we turn to Greenland, Honan, if you look at, as Anton mentioned about the return of Monroe Doctrine, what does it mean to regional countries in Latin America? What does it mean, to their cooperation, with China, with other countries? Chinese investment is important. Trade with China is important. For many countries, China is the largest trading partner.
Sure, indeed. And I also think that we should look to the big picture here, and I could not agree more with my colleagues. This crisis triggered in Venezuela cannot be analyzed in isolation. We are living through multiple overlapping crises. A crisis, of course, of the US hegemony, of the neoliberal capitalism, a crisis of multilateralism. And the United States and the West no longer provide solutions with broad global legitimacy. Anton just mentioned the BRICS Plus, and I would also mention the return of the Bandung spirit of no interference, of mutual respect. And in reality, the United States and the West, in my point of view, are much more the cause of this crisis than the solution to them. And this is the deeper context of what is happening in Venezuela today. And I would like to say also that I believe it is simpler to indicate what Washington should do if it needs to hopes to strengthen its influence and appeal in the Western Hemisphere, and not pursue a power policy typical of the Cold War is something that must be disregarded by the U.S. And China delivers to the Latin American countries such as Brazil other paths to go, other opportunities to pursue multilateralism without unilateralism. So the Belt and Road Initiative, the China Select Forum, and other initiatives here in Latin America and beyond signals that we are witnessing the advent of what Professor Amitav Acharya calls a multiplex global order. Globalization will not end, but will take new forms.
Different forms there. Mark, Greenland could well be the next target. In what way the U.S. will seize Greenland, will take control of the piece of land from Denmark, and what will be the response from the European countries?
Well, I mean, the Danish Prime Minister has already said, well, if that were to happen, it's over for NATO. I mean, that's kind of fairly obvious, I suppose.
Does Trump care about NATO that much?
Very possibly he doesn't. But I mean, don't forget. I mean, this is the MAGA crowd have power currently. Things could be very different in a few months' time and in a few years' time. I mean, we're talking about the United States and a whole host of countries and spheres of interest. But I mean, in my lifetime, I've never seen quite such a naked and failing attempt, really, to influence global opinion. I mean, through the tariffs, through the threats, through the constant theatrics, Trump has created a whole array of former friends who have turned against him and against the United States. So there'll be plenty within the United States security apparatus and political apparatus and all the rest saying, this is doing so much damage to us. What do we do about it? But, in terms of Greenland, I heard Stephen Miller, the emesis of Donald Trump, explain to a reporter yesterday that, yes, Denmark had to be part of the United States for security reasons. Well, I mean, this is staggering. I mean, anybody would know, Denmark is a member of NATO. The United States has had military bases on Greenland since the 1950s. It's just so absurd that, frankly, many people just simply don't believe that it's happening. Now, the problem is that we've just seen in Venezuela, these threats do actually transpire and do actually come into action. And so, yes, I mean, there's a threat clearly to NATO. There's clearly the United Nations means very little to the United States. They wrote out a check for $2 billion the other day for humanitarian aid and said, that's it, effectively, reform or die. And then we'll use quite happily, as other Security Council members, their veto to get in the way of any criticism. So it is an extraordinary anarchic situation. And I think increasingly, as your last guest was saying, I think member states and countries around the world are going to be looking for new leadership in the United States, hopefully, but also to to think again about these kind of relationships that have been set in stone since the end of the Second World War. But, just finally, I mean, if you think about the terrible destruction of the Second World War, the promise for never again, and all of the work of our grandparents, our forefathers and foremothers in putting together the United Nations and all of these international structures, the International Court of Justice and all the rest of it. And for a coach and horses to be driven through all of this in such an appalling manner, it's just staggering watching what's happening, frankly.
It's a tragedy there. Zhiguang, finally, if you look at the issue from Chinese perspective, what does that mean to China, to China's Belt and Road Initiative, to China's idea of a community of a shared future, and China's interaction engagement with Latin American countries?
Well, I mean, China has always been and consistently been advocating the importance of multipolar world, and China has been acting upon it. And over the past decades, China has done quite a lot in terms of providing an alternative source for globalization, for internal development, for developmental funding, all sorts of things good has been provided through the Belt and Road Initiative, and all of these are under the condition of non-intervention. But Trump has demonstrated a clear way of intervention, and the intervention not done through the facade of international law or judicial justice. It is done through blatantly gangster style of harassment. And that, I think, would have a strong implication not to China, but more importantly, to the Global South countries. Most of the Global South countries, majority of them, have been relying or hoping for hedging between two multiple powers. And hedging, to be frank, is helpful for most of the Global South countries to develop their own capacity. Now, US has stopped that possibility. It basically says my way or highway, otherwise you're going to end up like Maduro. And I agree with Renan that the future for not only China, but the entirety of the Global South should be solidarity again. And this puts forward the most important element or sort of aspiration for the Global South countries as far as in the 1950s Bandung Conference. The Global South countries, the third world countries, the Afro-Asian, Latin American countries, regardless what name that you call us, have always been asking for solidarity for non-interventionist development. And solidarity, as we recognized, is the only way out for small and weak countries to be truly recognized as an equal partner on the international stage. So this, of course, has devastated impact, but it also has a sort of silver lining. I hope the silver lining would be, once again, reminding the Global South countries, as well as the world together, for the importance of solidarity and longing for an alternative future for humankind.
So you are suggesting like BRICS countries, SCU, etc., Global South will come together as a possibility because of what happened to Maduro and
I'm not
Venezuela.
saying will come together. I hope to say that we would come together.
Thank you. With that, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.